Okay, so from our discussions over the previous 2 weeks, we've established that the U.S. has an adversarial relationship with Iran, which culminates in the seizure of the U.S. embassy and taking of hostages there by Iranian students. We've also established that the U.S. has an adversarial relationship with Iraq, which is rooted in Iraq's nationalizing of its oil assets, of what was, on their property, and they nationalized it. And by doing so, it created a windfall of funding for Iraq. By 1979, they had a surplus in their budget of $80 billion. They were able to make major investments, shoring up their infrastructure, their healthcare system, housing, employment, education, up to a point where it was considered that Iraq had the highest standard of living in the Middle East. But Saddam Hussein wanted to, it is argued, to restore more favorable relations with the West and primarily with the United States. And so he sees an opportunity to try to repair that relationship by taking on the role of a proxy and in a war against Iraq. Now, there is a conflict going on between Iran and Iraq, and it is over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which connects the Tigris and Euphrates rivers with the Persian Gulf. And so they've had this conflict going on, and this conflict becomes the pretext for Iraq to initiate war with Iran. And through that, the U.S. becomes engaged with Iraq and goes to provide support. And in fact, we've seen many times what's become an infamous handshake of Donald Rumsfeld, then as part of the Reagan administration, being dispatched to Iraq and famously shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. Again, all of this is predicated on trying to restore those relationships. And so Iraq thinks that it is gaining favor. Let's have a look at what happens with, and what's important for me to emphasize is that this is putting together the pieces of the puzzle that will ultimately erupt in the U.S. wars with Iraq and Afghanistan.
The Iran-Iraq war was one of the more brutal wars around at the time. It brought into opposition two of the big oil-producing countries. Iranian oil suffered because of it, and so did Iraqi oil, because the war was fought largely around the oil fields of the northern Gulf.
This question whether the Iraq and the Iranian war, Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, whether this was something of a combination of the West against the Islamic Republic of Iran, it certainly was.
در شروع جنگ تقریباً 3 اردوگاهی که وجود دارن تو منطقه ما همه پشت سر صدام بودن برای جنگ با ایران و هر یکشون هم دلیلی داشتن برای این همکاری با صدام. غربی ها برای اینکه منافعشون رو در ایران از دست میدادن.
The United States didn't wish to see a victorious Iran dominate its region.
ارتجاع منطقه هم به دلیل نگرانی از سرایت انقلاب به کشورهای اونا.
The U.S. began to help Saddam Hussein with intelligence information, particularly technical intelligence on order of battle.
Saddam Hussein was fighting the war against the spread of the Iranian Shiite revolution into the Middle East. This was a battle to prevent the Shiites from breaking out and beginning to infest the Middle East with its religious and with its extreme fervor.
On peut dire qu'en Occident, la peur de la révolution islamique et de ses répercussions possibles dans l'ensemble du monde arabo-musulman l'emporte assez nettement sur les critiques qu'on peut concevoir à l'égard du régime de Saddam Hussein, qui a encore à l'époque l'image d'un régime certes très autoritaire et très dur, mais moderniste.
The feeling in the U.S., perhaps mistakenly, I think, was that the Iranians were more trouble than the Iraqis.
ما تنها بودیم.
And so let me get this changed. Let me share this one. And it's important to understand that while this Iran-Iraq war is kicking into gear, so too is a war that's getting started in Afghanistan, which was provoked by America under the Carter administration and subsequently supported by the Reagan administration. So it's important to understand that's going on in the backdrop, and it's separate from the Iraq-Iran war. But when the war ends between Iraq and Iran, Iraq, which had an $80 billion surplus, now finds itself financially distressed due to the war. And so Iraq turns to OPEC and says, we need to do something because we need added revenues. And they ask Kuwait, neighboring Kuwait to Iraq, to cut production so that Iraq will be able to sell more oil at a higher price. Kuwait, however, declines. Now, it's important to understand that hang on, let me get to the right place. Iraq is also claiming that Kuwait is stealing its oil by doing what's known as angle drilling to go from Kuwait underground via an angle drill to be able to get into the reserves of Iraq and to steal their oil. Saddam Hussein now is in a conflict with Kuwait. He calls Egypt's Mubarak to try to negotiate a deal. That doesn't work very well. He then calls in the U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie, to ask what will happen if I initiate aggression against Kuwait. How will the U.S. respond? The ambassador responds by saying that it's U.S. policy not to get involved in internal disputes within the Middle East. So they're essentially giving Iraq a green light to go and attack Kuwait. However, America is surprised when Iraq actually does what it indicated it was thinking about doing, This is really very troublesome. Why? Because if you think about it as an analyst, you know that there's a conflict going on between Iraq and Kuwait over the price of oil. You also know that Iraq has fought a war in Iran and that it cost them a lot of money, and they're looking to somehow increase their revenues. You know that Saddam is considering action because he has told the US ambassador as much. And so why was the US surprised? Is it because of incompetence? Is it because they're inept? Or, and this, I'm not trying to give you a conspiracy theory, I'm just suggesting it's worth considering. Did they want a war against Iraq in retaliation for nationalizing the oil assets? Let's take a look at the US going to war. Let me get this queued up properly. Resume here. I think I have the
King and Aspen for the president was the British Prime Minister Margaret
at
Thatcher.
152.
The victor in the winter of that was an American.
And I got back here. Share.
There were Iraqis there, and there were lots of allies in the coalition were there. But it was a U.S. war from start to finish.
For the American military, this would be a war fought on two fronts: against an Iraqi army entrenched in the desert, and against the entrenched ghosts of an old war.
The Persian Gulf War didn't last for 6 weeks. It lasted for 20 years. Vietnam is a poltergeist through this whole thing. It had a psychological dimension as a consequence of Vietnam that transcended Saddam Hussein and the invasion of Kuwait somehow in ways that made this war larger than it really was.
This is the story of what happened when America confronted Saddam Hussein and itself in the Arabian desert. It was in July 1990 when American spy satellites first photographed unusual military movement in the Persian Gulf.
My intelligence officer came in and started to show me satellite photos and other intelligence which suggested an Iraqi buildup in the southern part of Iraq.
I hate to interrupt, but please make note, Colin Powell is going to say, yeah, we didn't think it was a big deal. What? 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 If it is such a big deal when he invades Kuwait, and you're going to go to war over it, before he invades, you should know if he does, we're going to react this way. But let's listen.
It wasn't immediately troubling because it was just a buildup within their own country. It did not have the backup that one would expect to see for an invasion of another country. The logistics system was not in place to support an invasion. They had not brought forward artillery. We couldn't see their communications coming up in a way that one would expect to see. And so although it was of interest and troubling, it did not yet become something of great concern.
The U.S. had sided with Saddam Hussein during Iraq's 8-year war with Iran. Now the Iraqi dictator was using his vast oil revenues to build nuclear weapons and equip a 1 million-man army that could dominate the Middle East. But the American government was confident it could contain his ambitions.
One of the basic problems at the outset of the crisis was that the administration was convinced of the rectitude of its policy towards Iraq, which was to extend them credits and to try to build bridges to Iraq to change their behavior. They knew Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but the idea, if we build bridges, maybe we can change this fellow's way of doing business. Meanwhile, the intelligence community in the summer of 1990 was watching what Saddam Hussein did and what he said, and they were trying to send this message to their political masters that the Iraqis were serious about moving into Kuwait, but the administration just couldn't conceive that its policy was failing, and therefore they turned a deaf ear to these warnings.
In Washington that summer, President Bush was distracted by a much bigger problem: managing the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War.
The idea that on a Sunday afternoon or something, I was going to stroll into the Oval and go, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Saddam Hussein is going to mass 100,000 plus forces and is going to walk into Kuwait and is going to make this the 19th province of Iraq. And this is going to be the major test of the post-Cold War world. That was too big. It was too dramatic.
Again, I hate to interrupt, but that's too big. What is that is your job. You're supposed to go in there and to tell him this is what's happening. But it was too big.
2 months earlier, Saddam Hussein had welcomed his neighbor and ally, the Emir of Kuwait. The Emir ruled one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Kuwait owned 1/10 of the world's oil. Iraq was rich in oil too, but Saddam's military spending had pushed his regime to the brink of bankruptcy. Saddam blamed the Emir for his troubles, accusing Kuwait of flooding the market with cheap oil, lowering prices, and hastening Iraq's descent into economic crisis.
We started to realize that there is a conspiracy against Iraq, a deliberate conspiracy against Iraq by Kuwait, organized, devised by the United States.
Later that day, Saddam would issue the Emir a stark warning.
He said, each dollar less in price means to us 1 billion in revenues for a year. If you do not mean waging a war against Iraq, please stop it.
But the Emir took a tough stand, and a month later, Saddam's inner circle decided that unless Kuwait handed over $10 billion to Iraq immediately, they would invade.
Iraq had no choice but to act, either to be destroyed, to be suffocated and strangled inside its territory, or attack the enemy on the outside.
The Republican Guard was ordered to move south toward Iraq's border with Kuwait. These were the Iraqi army's elite divisions, equipped with Soviet tanks. No other Middle Eastern country except Israel had forces to rival them. Soon, 30,000 Iraqi troops had massed on the border between Iraq and Kuwait. With the crisis building, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak rushed to Baghdad, sent by Kuwait and the Arab world to arrange negotiations. Mubarak, one of America's closest allies in the region, was determined to discover Saddam's plans. It was an encounter that would have far-reaching consequences.
I met with Saddam Hussein. He met me in the airport. Then he took me in the car. He was driving, this beside him, nobody with us, until we went to one of the palaces near the lake there. And we went upstairs to the first floor, tete-a-tete, in a big room, and we were both alone, nobody with us. I asked him about what's the problem, what's happening. I told, do you have any intention to attack them, invade them? He told me, no, but don't tell the Kuwaitis about that. It was a very clear answer.
As soon as he left Baghdad, the Egyptian president telephoned the White House to report that Saddam was bluffing. Mubarak told George Bush that the Iraqi leader was desperate for money, but that the Arabs would sort things out.
Since we didn't know the internal situation in Iraq, nor Saddam Hussein, our best bet was to take counsel from the people who did know him. And what he was really saying is, you know, don't jump in this thing. Just let it work its way out. You got to handle this guy right.
At his headquarters in Tampa, Florida, the American military commander responsible for the Middle East was following the diplomatic developments.
Every elder statesman in the world who was an Arabist was saying, oh, this will never happen. You know, an Arab will never invade another Arab. This is all a show of force on Saddam's part, and that the Kuwaitis will cave and grant him the concessions that he was looking for, and he won't have to do this invasion.
The day after Mubarak's visit, Saddam abruptly summoned the American ambassador, April Glaspie.
And in essence, what Saddam Hussein was doing was feeling her out as to what the American position would be if the Iraqis moved against the Kuwaitis. And the response that he got was a very satisfactory one.
Glaspie repeated for Saddam the State Department's position.
This was hardly tantamount to a warning shot across the bow. She said, we're watching you, we're concerned about the bellicose statements that you've been issuing, but our fundamental feeling is that we have no direct vested interest in Arab-Arab disputes, including the dispute that you're having with the Kuwaitis over the mutual border that you share.
Now, again, I have to point out, if you know that you will be enraged about Iraq invading Kuwait and that you will decide to go to war, I can't understand what you could possibly be thinking. You would have to communicate that we don't want to get involved in any disputes within the Middle East, but if there is aggression against Kuwait, we would take that very seriously, and we would have to consider intervening. You'd have to send that message.
As the meeting ended, Saddam announced there would be more talks with the Kuwaitis. And Glaspie cabled Washington. Saddam is worried. I believe we would now be well advised to ease off on public criticism of Iraq until we see how negotiations develop. The cable reached the president's Middle East advisor at a critical moment.
I had actually written a memo to the president saying, we're getting all this intelligence, obviously concerned, when suddenly the cable from April Glaspie came. And what I did was I scribbled on the top of the memo, what I've written you may be a little bit OBE, overtaken by events, Mr. President, because things look a little bit calmer now. April's just come in with the cable, essentially saying, I think this situation's going to wind down. We Americans need to sit tight and not overreact. I think by the time George Bush went back to the residence on July 25th, the general sense was a crisis that, while probably not past, had largely peaked, and that it was on its way to getting resolved.
But the Iraqi threat was still building on the Kuwaiti border. The original 30,000 troops grew to 70,000, then 100,000. Arab leaders continued to insist it was all a bluff. Then on August 1st, the Iraqis walked out on talks when the Kuwaitis refused to meet their demands. Saddam issued his orders.
We gathered at 4 o'clock on the afternoon before the invasion. And on a map table, we were shown our objectives in Kuwait. Our captain explained the Kuwaiti government was about to change. We had been asked to help set up the new government.
During the crisis, Major General Wafiq al-Samarrai held...
Let's jump ahead here to...
and thus perhaps being able to dominate OPEC was a tremendous danger to the United States and to the industrialized world. I thought it made a lot of difference.
To put it bluntly, what we ultimately did, sending 500,000 people around the world and all that entailed, that was too big of a thought for people at that first meeting even to think about. So instead, you had people talking all over the place, many of whom were talking about how we could live with this.
The president left to give a speech in Aspen. Brent Scowcroft traveled with him.
The president was way out in front of most of his advisors. He felt the same way I did about the sort of resigned tone of the meeting, and that there was no sense of outrage or no sense of imperative.
Waiting in Aspen for the president was the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. The victor in the Falklands was already thinking about war.
George Bush just said to me, Margaret, what is your view? And so indeed I told him that aggressors must be stopped. Not only stopped, but they must be thrown out. An aggressor cannot gain from his aggression. He must be thrown out. And really, by that time in my mind, I thought we ought to throw him out so decisively that he could never think of doing it again.
It was like...
Margaret Thatcher now is saying that an aggressor cannot be rewarded. Does she know the history of England? I mean, what, are you kidding? And she, I mean, this is, I just think that if when a country is going to decide to go to war, it ought to be doing so in a much more sober fashion than this. And many of these things, they're deciding on the moment. They're reacting to what is the discussion of the moment. So what you're getting is not a broad picture, not a context, so that you can make an effective decision.
Soulmates finding each other. They found from the very first words that they were exactly on the same wavelength, that this was a tremendously serious event, that it could not be tolerated, and something had to be done.
The president said little to the press, but he was already thinking about military action. Thatcher remembers telling him Saddam was a potential Hitler who must be stopped. Both leaders drew their history lessons from World War II.
Don't forget, George Bush fought bravely in the last war. He knew what it was like to fight. He was injured. So he knew that if you didn't turn out an aggressor, then you could have simply terrible consequences for future generations.
George
not attack again would be unwise and unrealistic. If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors.
The first American aircraft refueled above the Saudi desert. Saddam Hussein had never expected to see forces from America, the great ally of Israel, operating from Arab soil. But the invasion had turned both Western and Arab governments against Iraq. Soon, British, French, and Egyptian troops arrived, the beginnings of a coalition of 30 countries. Saddam struck back, rounding up foreigners in Kuwait as hostages.
Know who she was?
Yes, of course
they knew her identity.
They knew her identity, and they knew exactly what the girl was telling them was the truth.
How many people knew that she was the ambassador's daughter?
I didn't. I don't know who knew. I did not know she was the ambassador's daughter.
Now, I don't know the truth of the story, but it certainly undermined her credibility, and in a certain sense, undermined the credibility of the administration.
22 premature babies. They all died, and then they shot the hospital employees.
George Bush rose up in righteous anger and called this aggression a la the Nazi era.
The fight is about naked aggression.
The American people didn't quite understand that. Then the next argument was that the war was about oil, we had to protect oil.
If control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of that one man, Saddam Hussein.
The banners came out in Harvard Square, hell no, we won't go, we won't die for Texaco. That really didn't resonate. And then if you recall, Jim Baker got up there and said, it's about jobs, jobs, jobs.
If you want to sum it up in one word, it's jobs.
The American people said, what's this all about?
I'm deeply concerned about Saddam's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
And then the final thing in which capped the demonization of Saddam Hussein was the announcement that Saddam Hussein was secretly working on weapons of mass destruction, chemicals, biologicals, and most of all, nuclear weapons.
What is really important to hear here is that they've tried to roll out what's our reason to want to go to war. And so it's oil, oil, oil. No, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. No, it's brutality. Now we're getting to weapons of mass destruction. Remember, this is 1990. Come 2003, why are we going to go to war against Iraq? Let's roll out the same songbook that we played before.
And that's dealing with. We're dealing with Hitler revisited, a totalitarianism and a brutality that is naked and unprecedented in modern times. And that must not stand. We cannot talk about...
When you demonize an enemy, such as the president tended to do with Saddam Hussein, you raise expectations that you would do something about him at the end of the day. We did not know how to get Saddam Hussein. This is a man who has survived for 3 decades by nobody knowing how to get him. And so by demonizing him, which was a useful way to raise public interest and support of what we were doing, we also faced the problem of if he was still there at the end of it, which he most likely would be, it would take some shine off the achievement.
The Bush administration was having much more success building up international support for war. Their maneuvering led to a historic UN vote authorizing the use of force in 6 weeks if Iraq refused to leave Kuwait.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/21969 please raise their hand?
There were various concessions made to different countries whose support was critical. Egypt was forgiven $7 billion in various debts. Syria was forgiven many of the same sins of which Saddam was accused. Turkey was basically granted certain trade concessions in return for their very important support.
The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 678, 1990. We have taken political, economic, and military measures to quarantine Iraq and to contain its aggression. The nations of the world have not stood idly by.
But the UN resolution only deepened the fears of the American people.
There was very little public support in the United States for the idea of going to war in the Persian Gulf. In fact, it was overwhelmingly opposed.
If we were going to fight a war, we had to do so with the support of the American people, if possible with the support of the American Congress. But that if we were going to send people, Americans, off to die in the Persian Gulf, we had to be able to survive the judgments of history, that we didn't do so precipitously.
To go the extra mile for peace, I will issue an invitation to
Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz to come to Washington. In addition, I'm asking Secretary Jim Baker to go to Baghdad to see Saddam Hussein.
Just 6 days before the UN deadline for war, and after many changes of plan, James Baker prepared to meet Tariq Aziz. The Bush administration needed the talks to win over public opinion and a hostile Congress. But they feared the Iraqis might offer a deal that would split the coalition.
If there is a genuine, sincere, serious intention to make peace in the whole region of the Middle East, we are ready to reciprocate. When I went to meet with James Baker, I hadn't the slightest idea that that meeting would succeed. I knew that that was public relations, that he wanted to tell the Congress, look, to the end I tried to find a diplomatic settlement so that he could get a few more votes.
Baker carried a letter from President Bush to the Iraqi leader demanding withdrawal and reminding Saddam America had nuclear weapons.
The president's letter to Saddam Hussein, which Tariq Aziz read in Geneva, made it very clear that if Iraq used weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, against United States forces, that the American people would demand vengeance, and that we had the means to achieve it.
I read it very carefully. And then when I ended reading it, I told him, look, Mr. Secretary, this is not the kind of correspondence between two heads of state. This is a letter of threat, and I cannot receive from you a letter of threat to my president, and I returned it to him.
I could not accept the loss of life of any of our children in the Persian Gulf right now, and that tells me that in my gut, I do not believe that it's time to go to war.
I see no compelling reason to rush to military action. Of course, there are no guarantees on economic sanctions. There are also no guarantees on war. Where are the guarantees on war?
It is not an option for the Congress of the United States to disapprove what we for months have asked others to support. It is unthinkable that our government would now lose its will.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47.
We would not have won the vote without Geneva. We simply wouldn't. In the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, opposition to our use of force eroded. So it was an idea that germinated with the president. It was the right idea. We did it right, and there really should be no second thoughts about that. It worked exactly the way it should have worked.
In the beginning, George Bush had been almost alone in his determination to turn back the invasion of Kuwait. 5 months later, the man often derided as a political wimp had maneuvered his generals, his country, and most of the world to join his stand in the desert.
The president, privately, the most inner circle, made absolutely clear he was going to go forward with this action, even if he were impeached. The truth of the matter is that while public opinion and the voice of Congress was important to Bush, I believe it had no impact on his decision about what he would do. He was going to throw that son of a bitch out of Kuwait regardless of whether the Congress or the public supported him.
And so they threw the son of a bitch out, and we won the war, and that's it. Case closed. Everything's done. Nice, clean, finished. It's all over. We flexed our muscle, and we won the battle. And when the war ends and Iraq gets out of Kuwait, U.S. sanctions against Iraq continue. The Islamic world sees the U.S. sanctions as an attack on Islam. As Iraq ended its war, mind you, the Russian war in Afghanistan was also coming to an end. This is the war that America provoked. And as the Mujahideen celebrated its victory, a small group of Arabs who had joined the fight against the Russians in Afghanistan formed a new group, aligned with a guy who did not exist before we instigated conflict in Afghanistan. His name, Osama bin Laden. And, you know, when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, Osama went to Saudi Arabia, his home country, and he said, we'll throw the Iraqis out of Kuwait. We don't need America to do that. And we should keep America out of the Holy Land. Mecca, Medina, the holy lands of Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis then exiled Osama to the Sudan. And in the Sudan, Osama arranged meetings with other political and religious groups who were also fighting or agitating for change in the Middle East, with change meaning getting rid of the West. And it became the source of a loose coalition known as Al-Qaeda, the cell. All these individual groups would kind of get a common agenda where they would fight where they would fight against the West, what they perceived to be the repressive regimes of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Libya, and others. And so, mind you, during the fight against the Russians in Afghanistan, provoked by America, bin Laden was exposed to Azam, who was influenced by Kitab, who is written about in my term paper and gives you a lot of background. Kitab is the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood. The key point was that rebellious activity against individuals such as Mubarak should be channeled to what they viewed as the head of the snake. And the head of the snake was America. And so the US sanctions seem to give credibility to the notion that the US was at war with Islam. UN officials, in fact, resigned in protest against the sanctions because it resulted in so many children being killed. This is just to give you an idea of the distribution of where the Shia and the Sunni are in the world. Mind you, what we have is in Iraq, it is a Shia majority. Shia is the minority group throughout the Islamic world. The majority are Sunni. And so what you have in Iraq is the Sunni hold power, but they are the minority. And so when the revolution started in Iran, there was fear that the Shia uprising against the Shah of Iran would spread into Iraq, where there was a majority Shia, but controlled by a minority Sunni. And so they have their fight, comes to the end. They need money. That is, Iraq needs money. They look to increase prices for oil. It is Kuwait, the tiny Kuwait in the corner between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, that refuses to go along with that, thereby starting a fight between them. I think the circumstances surrounding that are dubious at best, and I think we really need to consider that. But what happens now is the sanctions are in place against Iraq, and that is going to cause chaos throughout Iraq, ultimately giving rise to the Islamic world believing that America is at war against Islam, and we'll see more of that come to pass with 9/11. Okay, with that, next week we're going to be looking at the war in Afghanistan, so we can get that piece of the puzzle put into place, and we can, which will ultimately lead to September 11th. Okay, we can open up for questions, comments, discussion.
Okay. Can everybody use the raise the hand function and put your video back on? And we're going to start off with Madeline, and give me one quick second. Okay, Madeline.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Back toward the beginning, earlier in the hour, I don't remember who was talking, but it was an Iraqi, and he was talking about the Kuwaitis slanting their drills so they went into Iraqi oil.
That was me.
And he said, now this may, I'm just asking you what you know about that, because he alleged that it was the Americans that were having the Kuwaits do that. Please comment, or do you have any idea?
Well, it's fuzzy. I mean, there was a lot of investigation into the alleged angle drilling, and there was supporting evidence to back it up. Of course, it never gets adjudicated in some kind of court of law, so you can, make sure the facts are the facts and all of that. It never reaches that level. But there was evidence of that, and there are those who, analysts, journalists, pundits, others, who say, America wanted to go to war with Iraq in retaliation for Iraq's nationalizing its oil assets, that it was big oil that was the major motivator behind that, and they will wait. They can develop a strategy. Remember, the nationalization of oil was 1972, and we're now getting the first Iran war, 1980. We now get to 1990, and we have the fight in the Gulf. And I'm not saying this is fact, but it is a reasonable argument that big oil may have been behind a lot of the political decisions that ultimately lead us to war. And so one of the motivators may have been one of the rationales for Iraq going to war against Kuwait was the angle drilling, and that could very well have been a contrived argument. But I don't know if it's true or not. As best I can say is just that is the arguments that have gone on. The stuff that I find really disconcerting, and what lends itself to more of a thought of conspiratorial actions, is that our government is fairly well corrupt. I mean, we've seen, you know, there's just been too many incidents and evidence of it to kind of walk away from it. And when you have an apparatus like we have with the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, all the alarm bells had to be going off before Saddam invaded Kuwait. There were multiple opportunities to flex the muscle and to say, don't do that because we're going to jump in there, and to act like, oh, well, we didn't think it was a big deal when he keeps adding troops to the border. Look, we knew Russia was going to invade Ukraine. That was like a no-brainer, right? It's the same circumstance. And so there's a lot of questions that I think went on behind the scenes that we have yet to be made aware of.
Harold?
Thanks.
Yes, the gathering of the Iraqi troops against Kuwait and the denial, at least officially on the part of the United States and others, that it's not going to happen, it's just a bluff, so on and so forth, brought to mind Harrison Salisbury's book, The 900 Days. And when the Nazis started gathering outside Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and they kept telling Stalin, look, they're gathering, they're having reconnaissance flights over it, it's going to be an invasion. And Stalin could say, no, we have an agreement. We have an agreement. It won't happen, and please do not provoke the Germans into attacking us. I mean, what kind of a obsessive denial possesses people to say something like that? I mean, I know the official version that comes out of the United States, but somehow I'm hoping deep in the back there are sane people who know what's going to happen and why it's going to happen. But they're trying to rally the American people with all these fake things about jobs and blah, 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 blah. And finally, they have to make something up about weapons of mass destruction, which ultimately proved to be a fallacy.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good analogy. Certainly, Stalin was one of those people who you couldn't say to him, I think you're wrong. Yeah. I mean, he was he was an autocrat. He was, he was a general. He was a military, just do as I tell you. Don't dare ask me any questions.
Yeah, it was like Hitler. They couldn't tell Hitler, you're making a terrible mistake of gathering all these forces against Russia. You're never going to take those people. But maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know.
No. I think what you get is, and Stalin had made a deal with Hitler, right, to become allies. The alliance as a way to, keep them from attacking them. So to admit that, wait a minute, they're getting ready to attack us would mean, admitting I made a big mistake by jumping in bed with Adolf.
Yeah.
And mind you, Stalin was not a guy who could admit a mistake, or if anything, he would kill the people who suggested.
Yeah, and 2 weeks, 2 weeks during the invasion, he was incognito. He was unavailable.
Yeah,
He went into hiding.
So it's a good comparison, but but the difficulty that I have is that we have such a huge apparatus to be able to, monitor world affairs and give an interpretation as to what's going on. To me, this is very clear, very obvious. We know that Iraq is in financial trouble. This is after having glory days of a lot of money. The war took their excess money. They now want to rebuild their coffers. This is not, difficult. And so it is Kuwait. Now, what you get is the Iraqi prime minister is, I'm sorry, not prime minister, but the Tariq Aziz is saying, we think that Kuwait's antagonism with us, it's blocking our wishes to increase oil prices, is at the behest of America. He's saying we think America is behind what Kuwait is doing. And so why? Because they know America, the oil companies are very hostile to Iraq. Remember, when he nationalizes all their assets, he's taking away from them some of the hugest reserves of oil on the planet. So, you know, they know this. And so for them to say, it's too big for me to go in and tell the boss this right now, that just doesn't add up.
Not doing his job.
Doesn't add up. The alarm bells would certainly be ringing.
Arnold?
Yeah, so Sal, wasn't OPEC in existence during this time? And since all this was, some of this was related to oil prices, what was OPEC's role in this, or their stance? And also, Saudi Arabia is such a huge power in the Middle East. Were they involved with this at all, or they just stood by and watched? So, well, question OPEC and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, well, first on OPEC, Iraq was one of the founding countries to pull together OPEC. Yeah. And they go to OPEC to want to increase what they want to cut production and increase prices. The objection against that comes from Kuwait, and Kuwait stands in the way of OPEC giving Iraq what it wants. And so that's where the hostilities are. Then when you look at Saudi Arabia, keep in mind, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Iraq is Shia, and America is going to Saudi Arabia to say, can we use your soil for air bases? They first wanted to talk to them about being able to fly over, but then it became, if we can get air strips here, it will help us in our fight against Iraq. So Dick Cheney gets dispatched to go to Saudi Arabia to negotiate that. Mind you, this is what's going to infuriate the Islamic world, is that Saudi Arabia allowed U.S. troops in the Holy Land of Mecca and Medina. Yeah. And after 9/11, by the way, what we'll get will be Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri. When they are asked, why did you do it? They will refer back to their complaints, one of which is having U.S. troops on the Holy Land.
I got two things. One, I think the highlight of this class was your line from Maggie Thatcher when she said, people invade cannot be rewarded. When you talk about the history of England, that's the highlight of the course so far. But more to the point, George Bush Sr. was head of the CIA. He had a brain. If he was incompetent, and then we had like the crazy guy before us, is this country's foreign policy doomed? Or we just, I know we always were corporate welfarians while we invaded, like in Guatemala and all, but is our foreign policy just doomed?
Well, I just think that when you contemplate what we're doing in the world, and again, I'm not picking any one individual administration because things can change based on who's in power at the time, but there is a great deal that goes on in secret behind the scenes, and I hate to sound like I'm endorsing the deep state kind of stuff, but there are there can be a lot of private agendas, and I think the key to looking at this stuff is to try to discern what's the private agenda that's at play. And my view of this is that the private agenda was oil, and the oil companies. Yeah.
James?
The bases in the United States went into Saudi Arabia prior to what you're talking about. We had bases in Saudi Arabia in the 60s when I was in the service, and they were regular bases. We later moved out. And when our troops moved into Saudi Arabia, they just had to turn on the lights and turn the valve on the oil. So the Saudis provided us with the oil that we needed to run the battles there. Also, oh, never mind.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
Okay.
I was thinking you were saying that the people around Bush were the ones that were saying there was no problem in the case of Saddam Hussein. They didn't ask Bush and they didn't tell Bush anything. So your alarm bells weren't going to the top because they didn't feel it was going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. And then when they got to Bush and Thatcher said, we're going to beat this son of a bitch. And and all of his people were refusing to do anything.
Okay, yeah, good. Well, you know, as you saw in the video there, George H.W. is aware of the troops building along the border, and he's more than cognizant of the conflicts that exist. Yeah. Okay, anything else?
Would everybody unmute, please? And switch to gallery. And let's give Sal a warm applause for
Thanks, Sal. Thanks, Sal. Always enlightening.
Okay, next week we'll go to
Taken off.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sal.